briefly in little flares. And it's when he goes back to in great grief, when his daughter dies, and you can have no greater grief in life than the loss of one's child. And his beloved daughter Josephine dies, and he's in the throes of writing Kim. And that transforms his vision, and he suddenly becomes a much humbler man. And you see him remembering the India that he loved, and you can see him in the course of that novel, which sets out to be a kind of boy's own manly adventure story about spies protecting the great British Raj, and all these manly figures of Mahbubali, Striding and Strickland Sahib, all laying down the law and controlling things. And it's that ordered life of the British Raj expressed by the railway. And then halfway through, the book completely changes pace. He leaves the ordered world of the British Raj, he leaves the railways, he goes onto the Grand Trunk Road, and he enters, which he says is a lifeline of India. And he begins one of his chapters, quotes a Hindu proverb, "I go to the hills, I go to my mother." And suddenly you enter the disordered, instinctive life of Indian India. And I hate to use the word ageless India, but you might say Hindu India. And suddenly, from being a masculine novel, it becomes a feminine novel. Suddenly all the feminine aspects of motherhood and nurturing, even the young boy, from being a sort of Islamic Christian novel, it suddenly becomes a deeply, not Hindu, but Buddhist novel. And I want you to go back to that book and see it as a book about not just a boy's search for his identity. Am I Indian? Am I British? What am I? Am I Irish? Kim, what is Kim? Who is Kim? Who is Kim? But also, what is my spiritual life? And at the end, he has this choice. Am I going to look to the West, or am I going to look towards the instinctive spiritual life of India as that novel deserves to be treasured and preserved. I think it's his greatest work.
We talked about Kipling's two sides of his head, and there's a great quality of empathy in Kipling's work, which we've covered. Like David, I think it's difficult really to identify one particular poem because there is such a range, and he's talked about some of the types of poem that Kipling wrote. But there's one poem that I often sort of like to come back to because it is humorous. There's a quality of humour in Kipling that is often underestimated. And this is a poem called We and They, which, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read because it's a fun little poem. But that is something that is missing. If it's there in the archives, which are just beginning to be opened up, how wonderful to discover that.
I think you
just shout.
Hi. Can I ask my question? Hi, I'm Rajiv. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please, wherever you are.
Right. Can I switch to a less controversial area, possibly? Like many Indians of my generation, I grew up on Enid Blyton and Billy Bunter, and lots of boarding school stories. And then later, I read Storky, and I thought this is probably the best boarding school story I've ever read. It's a pity Kipling didn't write more about Storky, but can you comment on Storky as the boarding school story of all time?
Not me, I didn't write it.
Yeah, it's funny actually that. Yeah, I've come to sort of appreciate it as a bit of writing, but when I first came to Kipling and I read these stories, I found them terribly arch, sort of trying to be clever. There was the sort of the show-off side of Kipling, which has its point, and I think you begin to appreciate that. I think perhaps you're highly intelligent and a sort of evolved consciousness, you were able to appreciate that. And somehow or other, it didn't do it for me. But, you know, there are, you know, for story, you know, when you look back on them now, I find them you know, a very fascinating portrayal of this bunch of friends growing up. You know, I don't know whether you remember them.
I'm always struck by how nasty they are in terms of revenge.
Public failure. More recently, Rudyard Sharma, who, by the way, is a local boy from Jaipur, but now the very high-powered head of emerging markets and global macro at Morgan Stanley in New York. And by the way, Ed is a half local boy because he's married to a Bengali, but now is the head of the US Bureau of Financial Times, which he was covering here in India before. So, more recently, Rudyard has looked at India from a comparative perspective and has dwelled on what it takes for a nation to get sustainable growth. So, what does it take for a nation to, what does it take a nation to become a breakout nation, as he calls it? And so, breakout from stagnation and to long-term prosperity. So I'll start with you, Rudyard. Well, is the India story over? Can India become a breakout nation? What will it take?
Great. I think that as far as this term breakout nation is concerned and what exactly I mean by it, my entire point was that if you look at the global economy over the last 30 to 40 years, there are countries which do well for a short period of time, and then those countries, sort of fade away. So if you look at the countries which were the economic stars in the 1950s and 1960s, they included countries such as Iran, Iraq, even Saudi Arabia, even Pakistan figured somewhere in the 1960s, and look what happened to them. So economic success is very difficult to sustain. And what I try and do in this book, which is an economic travelogue, is to go around the world looking at various emerging markets and figuring out which will be the markets which will surprise on the upside over the next 3 to 5 years, and which are the markets which will disappoint over the next 3-5 years, maximum up to a decade. And as I've said often, and even in the book, that the time horizon I sort of care about is what most practical people care about, which is a time horizon of about 3, 5, maximum up to a decade. Because anything longer than that to me just does not matter, because of the fact that, as I said, that the old rule of economic forecasting used to be that you make as many forecasts as possible and you remind people when you're right. The new rule of forecasting is you make forecasts so long out in the future that none of us will be here to know whether we were right or wrong. And I think that this is the fundamental flaw today when we talk about these projections about 2050, 2030. So when it comes to India, this is one sort of country, maybe I'm too close to it, but I'm slightly equivocal about, which is that I feel that the chances of India being a breakout nation are 50-50. And by that what I mean is the prospects of India meeting expectations are about 50-50. And I think expectations are key, because we know in India that if the country grows at 5%, you may say 5% is not a shabby growth rate given what's happening in the global economy. But after we got used to growth rates of 8 to 9%, 5% in India feels like a recession. And the slowdown felt that way. And also the fact that our per capita income is so low, at only $1,500, that we need much faster growth to catch up with the more developed countries. So I think on India, that's the message. But the good thing is that I find that expectations out of India have come down significantly. A decade ago, the expectations were low at about 5-6% when you wrote your book, as you mentioned, and then we got a near decade of 8 to 9% growth, which is what created this sort of India miracle kind of narrative. And then now as growth has come back down to 5-6%, that's leading to a lot of disappointment among people, because they got used to this sensation of us growing at such a rapid pace. Right. So I think that India can still be a breakout nation, but the expectations need to be recalibrated, and also the fact that now we know that we cannot put this on autopilot. That this rising tide of global liquidity which lifted all boats over the past decade, that era is over. We need to sort of row our own boat now. And in this environment, it's much more about what we are doing at home rather than just relying on global factors to lift us.
So what will it take to become a breakout nation for us now?
Yes, that's right. So I think that what I've done in the book is sort of come up with about like a bunch of rules of the road, that these are the factors you look for. And in this regard, I think that one thing that we're doing now, which I think is correct, which if you look at India, it's really interesting, which is every 10 years we face some sort of a macroeconomic crisis. And that macroeconomic crisis gives the country and the policymakers the impetus to launch some sort of reforms. And the good news is that's what's happening now, in terms of that we are once again not taking our growth.
I just read yesterday, my own country, the UK, hasn't grown. The economy in the UK is exactly the same size today as it was in 2006. The Indian economy is about 3/4 larger. It's about 75% larger than it was in 2006. Of course, this isn't comparable. The UK is a developed country. It can afford to stagnate for a generation without real hardship kicking in. And India is a country where huge hundreds of millions of people still live on $1.25 a day. So it's not comparable. But that's one of the reasons why I'm still fairly optimistic about India's capacity, its ability to regain higher than 5% growth rates, because it's quite easy to do. It's not easy to grow if you're developed. It's pretty easy to make another 2% of the country literate each year, or each 2 or 3 years. It's pretty easy to make roads which aren't potholed. It's pretty easy to develop water systems that pipe water into homes 24 hours a day, if you have the will to do it. So I think the core question that I come back to, but that I was obsessed with 7 years ago, and that you are clearly obsessed with too, because your most recent book, India Grows at Night, is on that subject, is the capacity of the state to deliver these basic services, basic human soft infrastructure that is essential for an economy with 1.2 billion people to actually thrive. If you're not building all-weather roads to villages, if you're still unable to do that, if you're still unable to get teachers turning up at school, more than 50% of teachers showing up, if you're still unable to build the most basic sort of facilities for urban hygiene, then this tells me two things. One, the state is the core of the problem, but it's also the core of the solution. You can't get, the Ambanis are not going to do this. The state is going to do this, and it has to do this. So that's really the core, for me, the core question.
And before we come to the answer to that question, that why don't we then do it? If it's so easy, why don't we do it? Let me ask another question to both of you. And that is, here's a nation which has amazing religious freedom. It has amazing political liberties. The press is vigorous and free. And Indians in the last decade, particularly the young, in the last 2 decades, half of India is a country which has never known in India that was not reformed. They're a generation after 91, and their minds are really free. Why does this country find it so hard to give its people economic freedom? Why must India rank with such religious freedom, so much political freedom? Why does it rank 119th